Today you will learn about the largest military operation in history, our series on Operation Barbarossa, presented as a single documentary. In 1924, sentenced for leading an attempted coup d'etat in Germany, Adolf Hitler was imprisoned in Landsberg prison in Bavaria. And during this period, he dedicated himself to writing a book that contained the sum of his political ideas, translating the thinking of National Socialism. The book was published the next year as Mein Kampf, My Struggle, and became a bestseller translated into many languages. Among the most controversial ideas that Hitler presented in his book was the concept that Germany was being squeezed and that the German people needed more land to expand their agricultural production and their settlements. And he called this space Lebensraum, or living space, the Lebensraum proposed by Hitler. It was located in Eastern Europe, particularly in the vast arable fields of Ukraine in the south of the Soviet Union. By framing the Slavic peoples as subhuman and communism as the natural enemy of National Socialism, Hitler proposed in his book the formation of Greater Germany in these territories, using as justification the Ostsiedlung, the movement of German peoples migrating to Eastern Europe during the Middle Ages. When Hitler took power in Germany in 1933, he began implementing policies openly hostile to the Soviet regime, with emphasis on the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936, in which Japan and the Third Reich made commitments to measures of protection against the actions of the Communist International. However, with tensions over the Polish question intensifying in 1939, the German government found itself isolated by the Franco-British guarantees given to Poland and had to seek an approach with the Soviet Union. In August, the German foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, launched a diplomatic offensive to draw up a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, which would allow Germany to move freely against Poland. The Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin, saw in this opportunity the ideal way to re-establish his control over the Russian territories lost during the 1917 revolution, and he authorized his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, to sign a non-aggression pact with Ribbentrop. This included a secret protocol for the division of Eastern Europe. Into German and Soviet spheres of influence, the document divided Poland between the two powers and placed Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the Soviet sphere, including the Romanian province of Bessarabia. Germany and the Soviet Union committed to jointly resolving the Polish question and to informing each other in advance of any action within this shared zone of interest. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, followed by the Soviet Union 17 days later. Poland surrendered on October 6th, being torn apart between the two powers and officially ceasing to exist. However, British determination to continue the war against Germany meant that Hitler was now cut off from most of his trading partners by sea, and Berlin's relations with the Soviet Union evolved in the following months, culminating in the German-Soviet trade agreement of February 11, 1940, in which the Germans committed to exporting high-tech military equipment to the Soviets in return for millions of tons of raw materials like oil and grains like wheat, thus bypassing the naval blockade imposed by the British Navy. Meanwhile, the Soviet difficulties against the determined Finnish resistance in the Winter War made a deep impression on the German military leadership. They interpreted these events as a clear sign of the military weakness of the Red Army. But at that moment, German attention was focused far away from there. On May 10, 1940, the Wehrmacht launched its great offensive against Western Europe, simultaneously invading the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And in the following weeks, they achieved a magnificent victory against the French, also isolating the British Expeditionary Force, which was forced to evacuate the continent. During the final phase of the campaign in France, Moscow decided to take advantage of the moment of imbalance in the balance of power in Europe and sent an ultimatum to Lithuania on June 14th, threatening it with invasion if it did not allow Soviet troops to enter its territory. And under threat, the country was occupied the next day. The same happened with Estonia and Latvia on June 16th. And in August, the three countries were annexed to the Soviet Union. To Stalin's shock, who was expecting a long and exhausting war between the European powers, France signed its surrender to Hitler on June 22nd, virtually making Germany the absolute master of continental Europe. But the sudden French collapse also allowed him to implement a new territorial expansion. France was a guarantor of Romania's territorial integrity, a rich nation in southeastern Europe, but its surrender had rendered such protection null and void. Thus, on June 14th, Molotov informed Ribbentrop that Moscow would go ahead with its plans to annex the Romanian provinces of Bessarabia and Bukovina. Ribbentrop replied by questioning the fate of the German population in Bessarabia, and he emphasized that Bukovina was not in the Soviet sphere of influence, which constituted a violation of the Non-Aggression Pact. 2 days later, the Soviets sent an ultimatum to the Romanian government, and Bucharest responded by mobilizing its army to resist. However, on June 28th, after being advised by German and Italian diplomats, the Romanian government decided to give in and evacuate the provinces, which were occupied by the Red Army in the following days. The unnegotiated occupation of Bukovina made Hitler even more suspicious of Stalin, and in July, he authorized the German High Command to begin drafting plans for a possible invasion of the Soviet Union, which was named Operation Otto and placed under the responsibility of General Erich Marx. The loss of territories by Romania destabilized the government in Bucharest. On September 6, Marshal Ion Antonescu took power, who immediately sought Hitler's help against the Soviets. He authorized German troops to enter the country in October, and Hitler quickly responded to Antonescu's gesture. With the goal of securing the Ploiești oil fields for Germany, the largest in Europe. On the other hand, meanwhile, there were ongoing attempts to draw the Soviet Union into the Tripartite Pact, which had been signed by Germany, Italy, and Japan on September 27, with the idea of forming a single Eurasian bloc, antagonistic to the British Empire. After initial negotiations led by the German ambassador in Moscow, Friedrich von der Schulenburg, in October, Stalin asked Ribbentrop for Molotov to visit Berlin to discuss joining the pact. Ribbentrop replied affirmatively, saying, "In the Führer's opinion, it seems to be a historic mission for the four powers, the Soviet Union, Italy, Japan, and Germany, to adopt a long-term policy to guide the development of their peoples along the right paths, defining their interests on a global scale." On November 12th, Vyacheslav Molotov arrived in Berlin, being welcomed by a band playing the Internationale, the Soviet anthem, which had been banned in Germany since 1933. In a meeting with Ribbentrop and Hitler, Vyacheslav Molotov was told the Third Reich would not oppose the Soviet Union to obtain its long-desired ocean port in warm waters by capturing the territory of Persia and Pakistan. However, the maritime outlet desired by Joseph Stalin was much closer. Passing through the Turkish Straits of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, Hitler became uneasy with the Soviet demand, because by giving the Soviet Navy access to the Mediterranean, he saw all of southern Europe as potentially threatened by Stalin. However, Molotov went further. Stalin wanted to bring all of Bulgaria under Soviet control, occupying it militarily, just as he had done in the Baltics. This time, Hitler was adamantly opposed, because by occupying Bulgaria, the Soviet Union would have a starting point to spread throughout the entire Balkan region. And even with Stalin's pressure for a resolution through constant telegrams, the situation was not resolved. Finally, Molotov questioned Hitler about the reason why German troops had occupied Finland, and Hitler said that his soldiers were there only passing through to Norway. The German dictator then returned the question, asking if the Soviet Union was once again considering war against Finland, to which Molotov replied, "If we feel threatened again, we will be able to liquidate it." Without making further progress in the negotiations, Molotov returned to Moscow, and on November 25th, presented a counter-proposal to sign the Tripartite Pact, with 5 demands. German troops would leave Finland in exchange for a guarantee of peace with the country and the continuation of Finnish exports to Germany. Signing of a mutual assistance pact with Bulgaria, which would allow the establishment of Soviet bases in the country. The main Soviet territorial advance would take place south of Baku, where Persia was located. Japan's renunciation of its rights over the northern part of Sakhalin Island. The public endorsement that the Bulgarian-Soviet Mutual Assistance Pact was a political necessity. As seen, 2 of Stalin's 5 demands concerned Bulgaria, a point that Hitler did not want to concede, and a response to this proposal was never given. From then on, the relationship between Germany and the Soviet Union would only get worse. On December 5th, Hitler received the invasion plans for the country, which stipulated that the objective of the operation should be the establishment of the AA line, control from Arkhangelsk in the Arctic to Astrakhan at the mouth of the Volga River in the Caspian Sea, thus establishing a definitive security zone for German territory. But still dissatisfied with the result, on December 18th, he issued the famous Führerbefehl 21, or Führer Directive No. 21, which demanded the development of a new battle plan, named Operation Barbarossa in honor of the Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa, one of the commanders of the Third Crusade in the 12th century. With the goal of eliminating the Soviet Union in a quick campaign lasting a few months, Hitler declared that it would be a war of extermination, because both the communist state and the local population had to disappear to make room for the new Lebensraum. To that end, secretly, the government sectors in Berlin began to develop the General Plan East, or General Plan for the East, which established the methodology for the ethnic cleansing of all the conquered territory, with the Germanization of some minorities, expelling to the Urals the peoples ruled by what they labeled as Jewish Bolshevism. Meanwhile, Stalin declared to his generals that from that moment on, the Soviet Union should prepare for an imminent war, and at the beginning of the following year, he ordered the 1941 Mobilization Plan, which called for the deployment of 186 divisions, forming a first strategic echelon on the western border of the country. In addition to this, the formation of a second echelon was ordered, with another 57 divisions, whose existence the Germans were completely unaware of. From the beginning, German planning assumed the use of 2 foreign territories as a starting base for their attacks, Finland and Romania. And still in December 1940, the Finnish General Paavo Talvela went to Berlin to meet with Franz Halder and Hermann Göring, becoming the first foreigner to learn about the plans for Barbarossa. Throughout the first half of 1941, the Finns made their offensive plans in coordination with the Germans, aiming to recover their territories lost to the Soviet Union in the Winter War. The high degree of trust that the Germans placed in the Finns could be seen in their early participation in the Barbarossa plans, since the next person to be informed, Johann Antonescu, only received the notice on June 11, 1941. However, Antonescu showed extreme enthusiasm with the news, mobilizing 2 entire Romanian armies in just 10 days. Initially scheduled to begin on May 15, Operation Barbarossa ended up being delayed to June 22 due to the unexpected pro-British coup d'etat in Yugoslavia, which forced the Germans to invade the country in April. The late thaw that spring also left the ground soaked in May, preventing large military maneuvers on the Soviet border before June. German military planners analyzed historical examples, and they concluded that the Red Army would probably not retreat into the interior of the country due to the high cost of losing its western regions, which would be defended no matter what. Therefore, the entire operation was based on the assumption that the Red Army would have to be destroyed in the first weeks of fighting. In disagreement with many of his generals, Hitler did not see Moscow as a priority target. From the beginning, he prioritized capturing the Don River Basin in Ukraine over the Soviet capital to cut off the enemy's food supply as soon as possible. By the end of February 1941, about 700,000 German soldiers were already concentrated in Romania, and this number would grow alarmingly in the following months, from the Romanian coast on the Black Sea to the north of Finland. In the end, Hitler's force would reach 3 million German soldiers and another 800,000 from his allies, making Barbarossa the largest military offensive in history. On the other side of the border, Soviet mobilization was also growing at a rapid pace, and by June the Soviets had already mobilized 5.5 million men, with an impressive reserve of 14 million as well, with at least basic military training. Through his vast intelligence network abroad, Stalin received information about June 22 as the start date of the German offensive. But since several other reported dates had already proven to be false, he didn't give much importance to this information. The Russian historian Mikhail Melkorov claims that the Soviet mobilization signaled preparations for their own invasion of Europe, which could begin on July 15th, when 8 armies and all their air support would have completed their mobilization. General Georgy Zhukov, Chief of Staff of the Red Army, issued a report to Stalin on May 15th saying, according to our intelligence service, in total, Germany and its allies could deploy up to 240 divisions against us. Given that Germany has its army fully mobilized and with extensive rear areas, they have the ability to deploy easily and launch a surprise attack to prevent this and defeat their army. I do not consider it prudent, under any circumstances, to yield the initiative to the German command. We must get ahead of our enemies in planning and attack the German army at the moment they are preparing, and they would not have time to organize their weapons for defense. With the Soviet mobilization still underway, the balance between the Axis and the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, was as follows, distributed: 128 against 174 divisions, 36,000 against 60,000 artillery pieces, 3,700 against 15,600 tanks, and 3,400 against 10,700 aircraft. The German attack formation was organized into 4 major commands. In the far north, within the Arctic Circle, the Army of Norway, under the command of General Nicholas von Falkenhorst, was responsible for taking the railway and the port of Murmansk. Departing from East Prussia was Army Group North, under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, which was supposed to advance through the Baltic republics and capture Leningrad in cooperation with the Finnish forces. In Poland was Army Group Center, commanded by Marshal Fedor von Bock, with the greatest support of armored units and aviation. It was supposed to advance towards Smolensk, destroy the bulk of the Red Army, and finally capture Moscow. And in southern Poland and Romania was Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, which was reinforced by the Romanian armies. It was supposed to advance and capture the fertile plains of Ukraine and move towards the Volga, to eventually capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. The 1st and 2nd Luftflotten, or air fleets, provided support for Operation Barbarossa, one for each army group, making up 65% of all the Luftwaffe's available air strength at the time. At 1 o'clock post-meridiem on June 21st, the army groups received the code word Dusseldorf by radio from Berlin, indicating that Barbarossa would begin the next day, passing the order down through their chain of command. At 9 o'clock post-meridiem, a German deserter named Alfred Liskov swam across the Bug River, north of Lvov, and informed the Soviets that the attack would begin that very night. Stalin was informed, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, on June 22nd, the commander's station on the western border received orders to prepare for combat, but also to avoid any provocations. This order was still being passed down the chain of command when, at 1:15 in the morning, the Wehrmacht's artillery opened a massive barrage of fire along the entire Soviet border from north to south, thus beginning Operation Barbarossa. With the bewildered border garrisons being caught by surprise on that Sunday morning, Hitler's 3 million soldiers crossed the eastern border of Europe and set foot for the first time on Soviet Union soil, opening the largest and most intense battlefront in history. The dawn of Sunday, June 22, 1941, seemed like just another calm and comfortable start to a summer week for the people of Moscow, except for the unusual movements seen near the Kremlin and the Commissariat of Defense of the Soviet Union. Crowds still confused in the streets wondered what could be happening. Until noon, the nervous voice of the Soviet Foreign Minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, began to sound on the radio and the capital's loudspeaker system. Today at 4 in the morning, German troops invaded our country. Without making any demands to the Soviet Union and without any declaration of war, they attacked our borders at several points and have already heavily bombed cities like Zhytomyr, Kiev, Sevastopol, and Kaunas, resulting in over 200 casualties. The government calls on you, citizens of the Soviet Union, to close ranks around our triumphant Bolshevik Party, around our Soviet government, and around our great leader, Comrade Stalin. Our cause is just the enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours. Operation Barbarossa had begun that morning with a powerful advance by land along the Soviet border, which stormed the country's border garrisons. The Luftwaffe took off with thousands of bombers to attack troop concentrations, supply depots, and airfields near the front line, which had been located during the reconnaissance flights. In the days leading up to the invasion, regional command centers in the rear were also attacked based on information provided by Soviet dissidents. The air offensive was precise and devastating, with German pilots claiming they destroyed nearly 1,500 aircraft on the first day, and that number reached 3,000 by June 28th. Hermann Göring was suspicious of this scale of destruction, ordering an audit of the wreckage at the captured airfields, which proved that the numbers reported by the pilots were actually conservative, because close to 2,000 aircraft had been destroyed on the first day, with 4,000 being destroyed in the first 72 hours. Such destruction was possible because the Soviet Air Force had concentrated its aircraft in massive rows at airfields near the border, apparently without any concern for dispersing their assets. This resulted in the Luftwaffe achieving effective air supremacy over the battlefield from the very first days of combat, despite significant losses in some units. And on July 5th, the German High Command reported the loss of 30% of its air force, which had started the fight on June 22nd, 4 hours after the opening of the German offensive. At 7:15 a.m., the confused Soviet High Command finally ordered its troops to open fire on the Germans. But 2 hours later, at 9:15, still unaware of the size of the enemy force, Stalin ordered a counterattack along the entire border. This order changed the desperate situation of the frontline forces, who had been trying to retreat individually against the Germans. Complete chaos. Departing from East Prussia, Army Group North crossed the border into Lithuania, which was occupied by the Soviets, with their advance being led by the 4th Panzer Group. Under General Erich Heppner, they progressed 80 kilometers on the first day. However, the commander of the Northwestern Front, General Fyodor Kuznetsov, received Stalin's order and immediately began preparations for a counterattack. The next day, near Germany, the 3rd and 12th Soviet Mechanized Corps, with a total of 750 tanks, counterattacked the 41st Panzer Corps under General Georg Hans Reinhardt in an attempt to block their advance to the north. It was on this occasion that the Germans made their first contact with a shocking reality: the new T-34 tank, whose existence they were completely unaware of. At the same time, Raziny was the first encounter the Germans had with the heavy Klimov-Voroshilov 1 and Klimov-Voroshilov 2 tanks, which incredibly withstood all the shots from their anti-tank guns until they were knocked out by shots fired from just 50 meters away. On June 24, a Klimov-Voroshilov 1 single-handedly stopped the 6th Panzer Division's advance for 24 hours. The crew of the Soviet armored vehicle destroyed 5 German anti-tank guns. Before their vehicle was hit in the rear by an 88 millimeter that destroyed its engine. The crew kept resisting, firing the machine gun, but the German infantry approached and threw grenades through the hatches, eliminating all the crew members, who then had their bodies removed from inside and buried with military honors. The Soviet defeat suffered at Razanie was caused by the unpreparedness of their command. They deployed the armored vehicles in small groups, allowing them to be easily destroyed by German anti-tank weapons. And this situation would be repeated incessantly throughout Operation Barbarossa. Almost the entire Soviet armored force in the north was annihilated in the battle. This allowed the rapid German advance to the Dwina River, which was crossed by the 56th Panzer Corps under General Erich von Manstein. Reluctantly, Manstein then had to halt his advance to wait for the arrival of the infantry divisions, which had been left behind, only resuming the offensive on July 2nd. That was when the armored vanguards clashed against the defenses of the Stalin Line, a network of semi-finished fortifications that ran along the old Soviet border of 1939. They broke through it on the 8th, and 6 days later, Manstein reached Lake Ilmen, on whose northern shore ran the road connecting Leningrad to Moscow, at the same time as Army Group North advanced on Leningrad. The Finns had launched their offensive to retake Karelia on July 10th, and 6 days later, the Finnish 6th Corps reached the northern shore of Lake Ladoga, splitting the Soviet 7th Army in two. On July 31st, the 2nd Corps launched its offensive against the Karelian Isthmus and captured the regional capital, Viipuri, on August 23rd. In northern Finland, the Army of Norway launched the offensive phase of Operation Silver Fox on June 29th, with General Edward Dittle's Mountain Corps advancing against the Soviet defenses of the important port of Murmansk. After achieving initial success, the German mountain troops advanced to the Litsa River halfway to Murmansk, where they were blocked by enemy resistance and the difficulties of the terrain. Further south in early July, the 36th German Army Corps under General Hans Feige and the 3rd Finnish Corps under General Hjalmar Silasvuo. They attacked the Sala sector, aiming to reach Kandalaksha and cut the Murmansk Railway, thus isolating the Arctic port. The German corps faced heavy enemy resistance and gained little ground, but Silasvuo's troops were more successful, managing to drive out the Soviets and capture Kestinga on August 7th, finishing only 30 kilometers from the railroad. However, the Soviets moved large reinforcements into the sector, which effectively stopped the Finnish advance. Meanwhile, in the southern sector, between the Pripyat marshes and the Black Sea, Army Group South began its attack on the 22nd, but only with the northern pincer, which was separated from the southern pincer by 300 kilometers by the Carpathian Mountains. General Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group led the attack on General Mikhail Kirponos's southwestern front. He was ordered to counterattack to destroy the panzers that were already advancing towards Dubno and Brody. The gigantic Soviet armored force, made up of 3,500 tanks from 8 armored divisions, was supposed to attack and immediately destroy Kleist's 750 tanks. And the Chief of Staff of the Red Army, General Georgy Zhukov, flew directly from Moscow to Kirponos's headquarters to oversee the operation. Kirponos received a nervous Zhukov on June 23rd, reporting to him the disorganization of the armored units and asking for 2 more days to organize his forces for the attack. But Zhukov was emphatic, demanding the immediate launch of the offensive. Thus, in the early morning of June 24th, the Soviet tanks set out to meet the Germans in the Brody region. They had to travel a long way to the location, which caused the loss of several vehicles due to mechanical problems, before even encountering the enemy. The battle began on the morning of the 26th, with only half of the Soviet force attacking together, the 3rd and the 48th Panzer Corps, the 8th Soviet Mechanized Corps. With the largest number of heavy tanks, they managed to push the 16th Panzer Division west of Brody, isolating the 11th Panzer Division from the rest of the German armored force. But the next day, with the arrival of Wehrmacht infantry, armed with a vast number of anti-tank guns and concentrated attacks from the Luftwaffe's Stukas, the Soviet armored force was decimated, with the loss of 2,700 tanks in total. The gigantic number of armored vehicles involved in the Battle of Brody even surpassed the clash at Prokhorovka in 1943, making it considered the largest tank battle in history. The rest of the Southwestern Front's forces were drawn in by the advance of the 17th German Army, under General Karl Heinrich von Stiepnagel, who had the Hungarian Motorized Corps in his ranks, and the Slovak Expeditionary Force. On July 2nd, the southern pincer of Field Marshal Rundstedt's army group attacked, with the 11th German Army, under General Eugen Ritter von Schubert, and two Romanian armies pushing back the southern front and capturing all of Soviet Moldova. While this movement was happening, the 1st Panzer Group broke through towards Kiev but suddenly turned south, causing panic in the Soviet rear. Suddenly threatened by encirclement, advancing from the northwest, the German 6th Army, under Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, kept up the pressure on the three Soviet armies until the 16th Panzer Division managed to encircle them around the city of Uman on August 2nd, resulting in the capture of 100,000 enemy soldiers in the following days. After such a disaster, the Soviets evacuated western Ukraine. Afterward, they set up new defensive positions along the Dnieper River, but they left behind a resistance force defending the port of Odessa, which would be besieged by the Romanians. Army Group South then took up positions along the Dnieper, preparing to cross it, and at this moment they received reinforcements from the Italian Expeditionary Corps, sent to the Eastern Front by Mussolini as compensation for sending the Africa Corps to North Africa. The new unit, made up of 3 infantry divisions, one of them motorized, was placed under the command of General Giovanni Messi. It was attached to the 11th Army, the first operating at the southernmost part of the battlefront. Meanwhile, to the northwest, the Germans had the capital, Kiev, still in Soviet hands, with the last major enemy formations in the region north of the city. At this moment, Rundstedt's forces were spread out along a vast front, lacking the concentration of power needed to take Kiev in a swift strike. Meanwhile, in the central portion of the battlefront, on the first day of fighting, Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center, with 1 million men, crossed the Bug River and entered Soviet territory heavily armed. With General Hermann Roth's 3rd Panzer Group coming from the south of East Prussia and General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group east of Warsaw, bypassing the fortress of Brest. On the first day of combat, Roth led his tanks toward the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius, while Guderian advanced directly toward Minsk. The commander of the Soviet Western Front, General Dmitry Pavlov, ordered a counterattack to destroy the 3rd Panzer Group in the direction of Grodno. But his armored units arrived late, as Roth had already passed the location, reaching Vilnius by the end of the afternoon on June 23rd. The hurried advance of Roth's tanks during those days was reported by Otto Carius, then a loader on a Panzer 38T of the 39th Panzer Corps. Our orders were to advance and advance again and again, day and night, without stopping. The impossible was demanded of the drivers. In no time, even I was sitting in the driver's seat to relieve our exhausted comrade for a few hours. If only there wasn't that unbearable dust. We covered our noses and mouths with cloths so we could breathe in those clouds of dust that hung over the roads. For a long time, we had already been leaving the armored hatch doors open so that at least we could see something. Like flour, the fine dust got into everything. Our sweat-soaked clothes clung to our bodies, and a thick layer of dust covered us from head to toe. If we had something to drink, it might have been bearable, but that wasn't the case. Drinking was against orders because the wells could be poisoned. We would get out of the tanks during stops looking for a puddle. We'd push aside the layer of moss with our hands and plunge our faces in. That's what kept us going. Roth's and Guderian's panzers met east of Minsk on June 27th, and on the following day, the German infantry division surrounded numerous Soviet formations in two gigantic pockets in Bialystok and west of Minsk, resulting in the loss of 400,000 men between dead and wounded. Because of such a disaster, Stalin dismissed Pavlov, who was tried and executed by the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs on July 22nd, along with other officers of his staff. On June 29th, the German High Command ordered Bock to stop his panzer groups to allow the infantry to catch up with them. But furious with the decision, Guderian decided to continue advancing towards Smolensk on his own, counting on the tacit support of Bock, who reported the movement of the 2nd Panzer Group as a reconnaissance in force. On July 1st, Bock gave orders for the tank advance to be resumed on the morning of the 3rd. But he was reprimanded by Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander of the army, who ordered him to wait for the arrival of the infantry. Bock did not give up and maintained his previous order, even informally authorizing Roth and Guderian to start the advance as early as the 2nd. A summer storm slowed down the advance of the panzers, and on the 6th, the Soviets launched a counterattack against the 3rd Panzer Group, resulting in a fierce 5-day battle, in which Roth, with the valuable help of the Stukas, managed to destroy almost half of the enemy's 2,000 armored vehicles. Guderian crossed the Dnieper River and advanced toward Smolensk from the south, while Roth, after fending off the counterattack, approached from the north, encircling more than 350,000 Soviet soldiers in a pocket in the city, including Lieutenant Yakov Jugashvili, Stalin's eldest son. Yakov served in the artillery regiment of the 14th Tank Division, and having ordered that Soviet soldiers should not surrender, Stalin was furious about the incident. Even with this additional success through gaps in the Smolensk encirclement, about 50,000 Soviet soldiers managed to slip out before the blockade was finally consolidated on August 7th. After a month of fighting, Hitler and his high command had realized that the Red Army was much larger than they had estimated, and that the great siege battles had allowed many enemies to escape and continue the fight. The major advances also brought immense logistical problems, because the German difficulty with the availability of motorized transport in large numbers made them heavily dependent on horse-drawn transport, causing delays in the supply of provisions to the front. Furthermore, Bock's 2 panzer groups had made Army Group Center advance much farther than the north and the south, causing a reckless exposure of their flanks to a potential Soviet counterattack. In this way, on August 12th, Adolf Hitler made the decision to divert Bock's panzer groups to assist Leib and Rundstedt, thus consolidating the flanks of the central advance. Roth would head north to help capture Leningrad, while Guderian would go south to encircle enemy forces north of Kiev. Several German generals were opposed to the idea, especially Franz Haller, the chief of staff of the army. On the 18th, he presented a detailed strategic study pointing out the reasons to prioritize the capture of Moscow. He emphasized that the city was the largest logistical hub of the Soviet Union and its biggest industrial center for armaments, and that its capture would resonate as a heavy psychological blow to the enemy. Hitler rejected the study, arguing that his Directive 21 already prioritized taking Ukraine over Moscow, saying he would authorize the resumption of the offensive against the capital. Immediately after the panzer groups completed their tasks in the north and south, as well as sending the 4th Panzer Group as reinforcements for Bock's offensive against the city. On August 23rd, Guderian went to meet Hitler in a last attempt to reverse the decision. But the Führer was adamant, arguing that the value of capturing Ukraine was greater than that of Moscow, because he expected a longer campaign than first estimated. And, at that point, taking the enemy's main source of food would be essential to ensure final victory. In this way, Heinz Guderian took an aircraft and returned to his panzer group, ordering a turn to the south, leaving Moscow on his left flank, contemplating the horizon that held the last 400 kilometers to the enemy capital, while advancing with his tanks toward the plains of Ukraine. When the outbreak of hostilities between Germany and the Soviet Union was reported to the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, in his office in London, he immediately ordered the preparation of a speech for the entire British Empire, where he would greet his new Soviet allies in the fight against the Third Reich. Dismissing his advisors to begin the work, Churchill was left alone with his personal secretary, Sir John Colville, who privately asked the Prime Minister how these orders balanced against his notorious and historic anti-communist rhetoric. Churchill replied to him, "John, if Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in Parliament." In the following days, a frantic diplomatic exchange took place between the two countries, whose relations had been marked by disdain since the beginning of the war. The emergence of new events completely changed this scenario, and on the morning of July 12th, the British ambassador in Moscow, Sir Stafford Cripps, went to the Kremlin to meet with Stalin, and there he signed the British-Soviet agreement, in which the two powers committed to coordinating efforts in the fight against Nazi Germany. From that agreement on, Great Britain began a convoy system to supply the Soviet Union with war materials, using the Arctic port of Arkhangelsk, since Murmansk was under threat of being captured by the German army. The first of these convoys set sail from Iceland on August 21st, arriving in Arkhangelsk 10 days later, delivering the first of numerous shipments of growing importance to the Red Army. At the same time, the British and Soviets invaded Persia on August 25th, overthrowing Shah Reza Pahlavi and opening a second supply route through Central Asia. Supplies for the Red Army would see a drastic increase starting from October 1st, when the American President Franklin Roosevelt approved the entry of the Soviet Union into the Lend-Lease program. The beginning of this relationship between the still officially neutral United States and the Soviet Union did not take long to directly affect the unfolding of Axis war operations against Moscow. On October 30th, the Finnish army had resumed its offensive against Kontalahti to cut the Murmansk railway and isolate the Arctic port. But Washington used heavy diplomatic pressure on Finland so that it would not interfere with its supply program. And the Finnish High Command found itself forced to order the end of all its offensives on November 17th. From then on, switching to a defensive mode. Without Finland's offensive participation in the war, the small German contingent on the Arctic front lost its ability to advance, and the whole sector was paralyzed, with operations continuing only on the southern border of the country. In that region, at the beginning of August, Army Group North had been blocked by a defensive line quickly erected along the Luga River, and on August 8th, the German offensive resumed with the 41st Panzer Corps advancing on Kingisepp, a junction that controlled the road to Leningrad. At the same time, General Ernst Busch's 16th Army advanced on Novgorod, north of Lake Ilmen, initiating a pincer movement to cut off the bulk of the Soviet troops, defending the line at Luga. With valuable support from the Stukas of Sturzkampfgeschwader, two commanded by Wolfram von Richthofen, Busch managed to seize Novgorod on August 16th, after a hard battle for the city. And, on the 20th, the 21st Infantry Division captured Chudovo, cutting there the railway that connected Leningrad to Moscow. In the northern pincer of the advance, King Saab was taken on August 17th, opening a large gap in the Soviet defensive line, which allowed the advance toward Krasnogvardeysk. This put all Luga forces at direct risk of encirclement. In this way, the Soviet front was dismantled and a desperate retreat was ordered. But on the 22nd, the encirclement was closed and 20,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in the Luga pocket. Meanwhile, the Soviets tried to counterattack at Staraya Russa, south of Lake Ilmen, on August 12th. But Marshal Lieb reinforced the sector with the 3rd SS Totenkopf Division, led by SS Gruppenführer Theodor Eicke, who, together with other units, managed to contain the attack on the 25th. In northern Estonia, after weeks of siege, the capital Tallinn was finally captured by the Germans on August 28th, forcing the Soviet Navy to evacuate the city and retreat to Kronstadt, their last remaining port in the Baltic. With his rear finally secured, Marshal Lieb could now focus on advancing directly against Leningrad. And for this offensive, he received reinforcements from the 3rd Panzer Group, led by Hermann Hoth, which had been diverted there from Army Group Center. On September 1st, the 39th Panzer Corps, commanded by General Rudolf Schmidt, captured the last railway connecting Leningrad to the rest of the country. And on the 8th of that month, he reached Schlisselburg on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, cutting off all land access to the city for good. To the west, on the 7th, the 41st Panzer Corps reached the Baltic coast and isolated a coastal area 65 kilometers long, which became known as the Oranienbaum Bridgehead, where the Red Army bravely resisted all attempts at obliteration, establishing a true fortress there. On September 14th, Stalin dismissed the outdated Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, commander of the defenses of Leningrad, replacing him with General Georgy Zhukov, who quickly began to reorganize his forces to resist the enemy's advance on the city. On that same day, Adolf Hitler decided to change his plans for Leningrad, anticipating a costly urban battle for the metropolis. He decided that the army should completely isolate the city and force it to surrender through starvation. The Germans continued to tighten the city's defensive perimeter until September 21st, when the offensive was finally halted. Massive air raids were carried out against the city and the Kronstadt naval base, resulting in heavy damage. Notably, the battleship Maha was sunk by Lieutenant Hans Ulrich Hudel on September 23rd in the operational sector of Army Group South. The 2nd Panzer Group, led by Heinz Guderian, entered Ukraine on August 25th, and without much opposition in its path, it went straight to Romny, 200 kilometers east of Kiev, putting the entire immense contingent of Marshal Semyon Badiany's southwestern front on alert for an encirclement maneuver. Even warned of the danger, Stalin forbade the evacuation of the sector. That would mean handing Kiev to the Germans on a silver platter. Stalin hoped to mount his own counterattack to isolate Guderian from the rear. But disaster struck on September 12th, when Kleist's 1st Panzer Group crossed the Dnieper River at Kremenchuk, speeding north to link up with Guderian. The Panzer Groups met at Lofitsia on September 16th, closing what would become the largest encirclement in military history. The next day, Moscow issued the order to evacuate Kiev, but it was already too late, and inside the pocket 665,000 men were surrounded. Stalin ordered Guderian's evacuation from the encirclement, and without leadership or mobile reserves, the besieged troops had no realistic chance of escaping. In the following days, the infantry of the 6th and 17th German armies arrived and began to press the pocket. Although they encountered determined resistance from the Soviet infantry, Reichenau ordered a heavy artillery bombardment of Kiev to decimate the resistance in the city, demolishing much of the buildings in the process. The city surrendered on September 19th, but the resistance within the pocket continued for another week. On September 26th, the encircled troops surrendered, with the Red Army having suffered 700,000 casualties in that battle. Such a catastrophe eliminated the vast majority of Soviet forces defending Ukraine. In the following days, Army Group South crossed the Dnieper at several points, start conquering the rich Donetsk River Basin, a major Soviet industrial center. With the elimination of the Kiev pocket, Kleist's and Guderian's panzer groups were redesignated as panzer armies. On October 6th, Guderian returned to the north and Kleist broke through with his tanks heading southeast to reach the coast of the Sea of Azov. The commander of the 11th Army, General Eugen Ritter von Schubert, had died in a plane crash on September 12th. He was replaced in the position by General Erich von Manstein. Shortly after arriving, he was given the task of conquering the Crimean Peninsula. However, before that, in coordination with Kleist, Manstein took part in the elimination of 2 Soviet armies that were defending the Melitopol sector. They surrounded them on the 10th, forming a new pocket that captured over 100,000 prisoners. From there, Kleist followed the coastline with the objective of capturing Rostov, a city that was considered the gateway to the Caucasus. At the same time, Manstein prepared to face the Soviet defenses of the Perekop Isthmus, only 8 kilometers wide, which gave access to Crimea. The Soviet command, realizing that Crimea was isolated, evacuated the port of Odessa on the night of October 14th, taking its garrison to the port of Sevastopol, the largest Soviet naval base in the Black Sea. Faced with the challenge of Perekop on October 18th, Manstein launched a frontal attack with 2 infantry divisions supported by a massive concentration of artillery, which in 5 days of heavy fighting managed to break through the Soviet defenses 15 kilometers deep and force its way into Crimea, then occupying the entire peninsula and capturing another 100,000 prisoners. Only the port of Sevastopol continued to resist, repelling all German attempts at invasion. On October 20th, the 3rd Bersaglieri Regiment of the Italian Expeditionary Corps captured the important industrial center of Stalino. And 4 days later, after a hard urban battle, the Germans took control of Kharkov, having occupied a vast area and faced continued enemy resistance. Army Group South was at its limit, but was ordered to continue the advance across the Meuse River to reach the Caucasus. Even under continued protests from Kleist, who warned about the exhaustion of his troops. Well, when the temperatures started to drop sharply, at the end of September, Marshal Bach, commander of Army Group Center, celebrated the return of his 2 panzer groups, also receiving reinforcements from the 4th Panzer Group, which originally belonged to Marshal Lieb. Now, with almost 2 million men under his command, Bach planned an attack on Moscow in the form of a double envelopment, with Roth's 3rd Panzer Group attacking from the north, Heppner's 4th Panzer Group attacking from the center, and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army attacking from the south. The long-awaited attack on Moscow, codenamed Operation Typhoon, was finally launched on September 30th, with Guderian making a sudden turn to the northeast and capturing Bryansk and Orel on October 6th, encircling 3 Soviet armies in the Bryansk pocket. The next day, Roth and Heppner's armored vanguards met east of Vyazma, this time encircling no less than 5 Soviet armies to the west of the city. And in the 2 encirclements, a total of 675,000 men were captured, suddenly cutting in half the strength of the Red Army defending the capital. That's when, in Berlin, Otto Dietrich, the government's press secretary, summoned foreign correspondents to announce that after such a defeat, the fall of Moscow and the collapse of Soviet resistance were imminent. The morale of the German people was raised, and rumors began to spread that the soldiers would be back before Christmas. However, on October 7th, a new enemy showed its face to the Germans, the Rasputitsa. The first snow fell and quickly melted into the ground, turning the unpaved roads of the Soviet Union into true seas of mud, bogging down vehicles and animals, and seriously hindering military operations. Zhukov was called from Leningrad and placed in command of the defenses of Moscow, and on the 12th, he ordered the concentration of all available forces on the Mozhaisk Line, a network of fortifications quickly built in the previous weeks. But after the disasters at Bryansk and Vyazma, Zhukov would have to rebuild the entire Western Front from scratch, and only 90,000 soldiers were holding the line when the Wehrmacht attacked the next day. In 24 hours, capturing Kalinin to the north of Moscow and Kaluga to the south of the city, such attacks sounded a siege alarm in the Kremlin. And on October 15th, Stalin ordered the evacuation of the Communist Party, diplomatic delegations, and cultural institutions to Kuybyshev, located 1,000 kilometers east of Moscow. The evacuation caused panic among the Muscovites, who crowded the trains and jammed the city's road network. With banks closed, many workers were left without their salaries, and cases of looting multiplied throughout the capital. On the 19th, martial law was declared in Moscow, and the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs took to the streets, executing on the spot anyone caught violating public order. Only after this repression And after Stalin publicly declared that he would remain in Moscow, were the people's spirits calmed, while the city itself was turned into a fortress. 250,000 women and teenagers were employed in the construction of trenches and anti-tank ditches around Moscow. They moved 3 million cubic meters of earth without any mechanical assistance. The capital's factories were entirely converted to the war industry. That month, the city suffered a series of air raids by the Luftwaffe, which, despite their intensity, caused little damage due to the tremendous number of anti-aircraft weapons deployed there, as well as the quick response of the fire brigades. With his logistical situation in a critical state, Bach went all in against Moscow, attacking the entire enemy defensive line. After intense and costly fighting, Mozhaisk fell on October 18th, Narofominsk on the 21st, and Volokholamsk on the 27th, forcing Zhukov to pull his forces back to the eastern bank of the Nara River. Guderian advanced with relative ease toward Tula, but when he reached the outskirts of the city, on October 26th, his advance was blocked by a counterattack from 3 Soviet armies. With a harsh winter looming on the horizon and his vanguards bogged down in the Rasputitsa mud, the German High Command ordered a general halt to its offensive operations on October 31st to try to ease their supply problems while waiting for the ground to harden from freezing on that same day, to boost the morale of the city's population and of the entire Soviet Union. Stalin ordered the traditional parade to celebrate the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution on November 7th in Red Square, even though the city was under constant enemy attack. Since there were no military units stationed inside Moscow, new ones had to be created to take part in the event, and the soldiers had only a few days to rehearse the drill, even without being told the real purpose of the exercises. The parade was initially supposed to be commanded by General Zhukov, but he couldn't leave his command post in the defense of the capital. And then Marshal Budiani was given the task, choosing himself. Several of the songs that would be performed by the 200-member orchestra of the Dzerzhinsky Division of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, under the baton of conductor Vasily Agapkin. A complete weather forecast for tomorrow, the 7th, could not be obtained because the weather stations west of Moscow were in enemy hands. A group of meteorologists predicted snow and low clouds for the date, indicating that the Luftwaffe would not be able to attack the city. Even so, as a precaution, the Soviet Air Force bombed the German airfields on the 5th. In addition to the infantry, 160 tanks would take part in the parade, including a battalion of Klimov Voroshilov, 1S, coming directly from the factory, whose presence was demanded by Stalin, who also ordered that the red stars on the Kremlin towers, which had been turned off since the beginning of the invasion, be lit especially for the parade. At 5 in the morning on November 7th, under freezing temperatures, troops and guests, including several foreign press correspondents, were taken to Red Square. And at 8 o'clock, Stalin's voice sounded through the loudspeakers. Comrades, men of the army and navy, commanders and commissars, male and female guerrillas, the whole world is looking at you as the armed force capable of destroying the invading German hordes. The enslaved peoples of Europe look to you as their liberators. A great liberating mission has fallen upon you. Be worthy of this mission. Death to the German invaders. Long live the glorious motherland, her freedom and independence. Under Lenin's banner, forward to victory. Next, 28,000 soldiers marched before Stalin, posted at Lenin's mausoleum next to the Kremlin's Red Wall. The whole world followed the event live on the radio, understanding that at that moment the Soviet Union was demonstrating its resolve against an enemy that had swept devastatingly through its territory and now threatened to take its own capital. A decisive clash would take place in the following weeks, and with tension running high once again, the whole world would hold its breath. On a sunny summer afternoon in the streets of Tokyo on August 25, 1941, two men were walking on different streets, blending naturally with the local population, both heading to the same address. One of these men was the renowned journalist Hosumi Ozaki, a close advisor to the Japanese Prime Minister Fuminaro Konoe, and one of his dearest confidants. The other was a foreigner, a correspondent for the German press named Richard Sorge, a notorious member of the Nazi Party and a frequent figure at receptions at the German embassy. During his 8 years living in Japan, Sorge had become a confidant of the German military attachés and diplomats in Tokyo, especially of the ambassador, General Eugen Ott, who constantly shared with him information contained in secret communications with Berlin. An expert at obtaining secrets from others, Sorge kept a dangerous secret of his own, which made his life a constant race against disaster. He was a Soviet intelligence agent. That afternoon, Sorge met discreetly with Ozaki, who told him the outcome of his most recent meeting with the Prime Minister. Aware of the weight of the information he now had in his hands, Sorge went back home and prepared a communication for Moscow, where he wrote, Ozaki managed to find out from Prime Minister Konoe that the Japanese High Command had recently discussed whether or not to go to war against the Soviet Union. They decided that they will not attack this year. I repeat, Japan will not attack the Soviet Union this year. The information reached the Kremlin just as the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center had halted its advance on the capital, diverting its panzer groups to eliminate the threat to its flanks. And on September 14th, Sorge supplemented his previous message, informing that Japan would only consider attacking the Soviet Union if Moscow fell. With this information in hand, Joseph Stalin finally decided that he could bring from the Soviet Far East the contingent he kept there to urgently face a possible Japanese invasion, consisting of 18 infantry divisions, 1,700 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft, thus reinforcing Zhukov's reserve force to counter the upcoming German offensive against Moscow. While Soviet reserves were growing in their rear, the German situation was moving in the opposite direction. Their powerful advance to the east had stretched their supply lines unsustainably, and now their limited number of trucks was trying to tirelessly keep up to bring to the front line men and material so urgently needed, but managing to deliver only a fraction of the required amount. To make matters worse, Soviet railways used a different gauge, wider than the European standard, forcing the Germans to readapt every meter of railway for their own use. This severely limited train use on the Eastern Front in 1941. This disastrous situation turned the last quarter of the year into a desperate race for the German army to deliver a fatal blow to the Soviets, extending their offensives far beyond the point where they could maintain them safely. After encircling Leningrad in September, Marshal Lieb turned his attention to establishing an even larger siege, taking the entire southern shore of Lake Ladoga and linking up with the Finns who had taken eastern Karelia to drive the Red Army away from the vicinity of the city, to drive them away. On October 19th, the 39th Panzer Corps began its offensive, crossing the Volkhov River and advancing on the important road junction of Tikhvin, which was also a rich producer of bauxite, capturing the city on November the 8th. However, advances north of that point were blocked by Soviet resistance and the lack of reserves. And on December 9th, a counterattack by the Red Army retook Tikhvin, then drove the German vanguards back to the Volkhov River line. This allowed Leningrad to be supplied throughout that winter by a route built over the ice of Lake Ladoga, which became known as the Road of Life. In the southern sector of the front line, Marshal Rundstedt's army group was advancing slowly along the coast of the Sea of Azov, with the already exhausted 1st Panzer Army leading the advance against Rostov, the city that controlled access to the oil fields of the Caucasus. On October 17th, the Panzers crossed the Mills River, and the 1st Leibstandarte SS Division, commanded by Zepp Dietrich, captured Taganrog on its eastern bank. The Russians managed to escape capture and retreated to the east, pursued by Kleist's tanks, which at this point became bogged down in the Rasputitsa mud, severely delaying their advance. Only a month later, the Russians struck hard in November. The German vanguards reached Rostov, and after 4 days of fierce urban combat, captured the city. On the 21st, with the Leibstandarte capturing 10,000 prisoners there. However, realizing the fragile German position, less than a week later, on November 27th, the 37th Soviet Army, under General Anton Lopatin, counterattacked from the north against Kleist's exposed left flank, aiming to reach the coast and encircle the entire 1st Panzer Army. Realizing the desperate situation his vanguard was in, Rundstedt authorized Kleist to abandon Rostov, which made Hitler furious with his decision. The Führer ordered an immediate counterattack, but when Rundstedt refused, Hitler dismissed him from the command of Army Group South, replacing him with Walter von Reichenau. But after analyzing the situation, Reichenau realized that Rundstedt was right and managed to persuade Hitler to authorize a withdrawal to the Meuse River line, where the entire southern sector stabilized with the arrival of winter. In the central sector of the front, in the first half of November, with his tanks paralyzed by the mud, Marshal Bock gazed at the eastern horizon with a growing sense of foreboding. His supply lines were dwindling the amount of available material, and fatigue was noticeably felt among his troops. Bock knew, however, that the Soviets had been receiving large reserves and that their defensive positions were now probably much stronger than they had ever been. But he didn't imagine that they would have the strength to mount a definitive resistance capable of stopping the German offensive in its tracks. By the beginning of November, Zhukov's defensive lines had been greatly fortified, now consisting of 3 concentric layers protecting Moscow, and his armies, for the first time, began to maintain a reserve force in the rear, with infantry, artillery, and engineering units ready to block any penetration made by the German armored divisions. But all these advantages were secondary compared to the most important one. The Soviet officers were now experienced, knew the tactics used by the Wehrmacht, and knew how to respond to them. This factor would make all the difference in the days to come. In the second week of November, Bock felt that the ground had begun to firm up and the sea of mud was turning into a frozen prairie. He then decided that the time had come to act. With 51 divisions for the attack, his plan was to encircle Moscow, using the 3rd and 4th Panzer groups in the northern pincer and the 2nd in the south, keeping the Soviet troops trapped in the center of the position. With a frontal attack by the 4th Army of General Günther von Kluge, the 2 armored pincers were supposed to meet in Noginsk, east of the city, closing the encirclement around the capital. On November 15, the Panzers began their offensive against Moscow, setting out from their bases around Kalinin. The 3rd Panzer Group, now commanded by General Georg Hans Reinhardt, advanced along the road to capture Klin, the next junction on the way to the capital. Skirting the Volga Reservoir to the west, Reinhardt suddenly turned southeast toward Moscow, using the canal to cover his left flank, approaching Klin and overrunning the defenses around the city on the 20th. Leading the advance was the legendary 7th Panzer Division, commanded by General Hans Freiherr von Felsen, and within it was the 6th Motorized Infantry Regiment, which was commanded by a short lieutenant colonel named Hasso von Manteuffel. During his advance, Manteuffel predicted that, at that distance from Moscow, the Soviets would try everything to stop him. And he warned his soldiers about a curious rumor he had heard that dogs were being used by the enemy to carry explosives and destroy German tanks. Despite the men's initial disbelief, it didn't take long for dogs to start appearing, coming from Soviet positions and being shot down at the first warning. Manteuffel's armored vehicle radio operator counted 42 dead dogs carrying mines strapped to their bodies along the regiment's path. After passing Klin, Manteufel decided not to wait and immediately proceeded east to cross the Moscow Canal, the last natural obstacle on the way to Noginsk. His goal was to complete the encirclement. He decided to attempt the crossing at Akroma, capturing the bridge in the area and establishing control of the other bank to allow the tanks to cross. To that end, Manteufel ordered his vehicles to hide in the woods west of the city, and at 2 in the morning on November the 21st, he sent an armored detachment ahead to capture the bridge, which surprisingly was taken without a fight. However, when they noticed the enemy movement, the Soviets around began to react, and Manteufel had to reinforce his fragile bridgehead on the eastern bank, as well as secure control of Akroma. At 7 a.m., still under Soviet fire on the east bank, he crossed the canal bridge and was surprised to find a hydroelectric plant supplying power to Moscow still intact. Walter Lenfers, one of the sergeants who accompanied Manteufel, recalled, "I was taking part in the attack against the Moscow-Volga Canal near Yakroma. When I saw our little guy enter the power station and turn off the lights for the Muscovites, he was always the first in the attack and the last in the defense." Manteufel then reported to headquarters the capture of the bridge over the canal and immediately requested assistance to reinforce his bridgehead. But the answer he received left him shocked. There were no reserves, not even a single soldier who could be sent to his aid. And from the high command came the order, Hasso von Manteufel should withdraw from the bridgehead and then blow up the bridge. With deep remorse, he carried out the orders, seeing in the wreckage of the bridge the lost chance to encircle the enemy capital. The withdrawal had a terrible and profound effect on the troops. Before, they had been ordered to capture Moscow, and now they were being ordered to retreat. A few weeks later, Manteufel would receive the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for his actions in Yakroma. In the road sector, the Germans continued their advance southward, capturing Salnakhnagorsk on November the 24th and Istra the following day. And on the 30th, the vanguards of the 4th Panzer Group, led by Erich Heppner, took Krasnaya Polyana, just 29 kilometers from Red Square. From there, German officers claimed they were able to make out the tops of the Kremlin towers and other major buildings of the city through their powerful field binoculars. Meanwhile, on the southern pincer, Guderian attacked on November 18th, initially trying to bypass Tula and its determined resistance contingent. The exhaustion of the 2nd Panzer Army, which had carried out the largest maneuvers of the entire Operation Barbarossa since its first day, was already evident, and the tanks could barely cover 10 kilometers a day, finally capturing Stalinogorsk on November 22nd. 4 days later, Guderian's vanguards approached Kashira, a major road junction south of the capital. But on November 27th, they were hit by the full force of a Soviet counterattack, which completely blocked their advance, bringing the southern pincer of the German offensive against Moscow to a halt there. With the pincers blocked and the possibility of encircling the city becoming increasingly remote, on December 1st, Bock ordered a frontal attack by the 4th Army. But, lacking armored support, the German force fought in vain against the reinforced Soviet front, unable to make any further progress. On the second day, a German patrol reached Khimki, just 20 kilometers from the Kremlin, marking the closest point the Germans would get to Moscow. The cold had set in overwhelmingly at that point, with temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees, immobilizing vehicles and men in their positions. Although also affected by the low temperatures, the Soviets had more experience in winter combat and were operating with much better infrastructure at that time. On the other side of the front line, General Zhukov had managed to gather 1,100,000 men in his reserves. He submitted to Stalin his plan for an offensive to drive the danger away from Moscow. Eager to relieve that situation, Stalin gave the green light, and on December 5th, General Ivan Konev's Kalinin front suddenly attacked the fragile German positions north of the capital. The next day, the western and southwestern fronts also attacked, achieving complete surprise against a stunned German high command. The Soviet counteroffensive was much larger than anything expected, and on the 8th, Adolf Hitler issued his Directive Number 39, ordering the Wehrmacht to go on the defensive along the entire front. The German troops on the front line were unable to hold their initial positions and were retreating individually before the Soviets, with Moscow's satellite cities being retaken by the Red Army in the following days. On December 14th, Halder and Klug acted without orders from Hitler and ordered a limited withdrawal of the entire battlefront to the western bank of the Oka River. But when he learned of this, a furious Hitler canceled the withdrawal orders and determined that not an inch of ground should be given up. The German soldiers were to resist at all costs against the Red Offensive, preventing the front from breaking. Facing several protests against his orders, Hitler reacted by ordering a series of dismissals, removing von Bock from command of Army Group Center, and culminating on December 19th in the dismissal of the commander-in-chief of the German army, Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, whose position Hitler then assumed for himself. Konev tried several times to encircle the 3rd Panzer Group, but the Germans managed to withdraw their troops in time, although at a high cost. He made one last attempt at encirclement, bypassing Rzhev, but the determined German resistance in that salient proved unbeatable, consolidating the sector that would remain in the hands of the Wehrmacht for another 2 years. Zhukov then concentrated forces in the southern region of the capital, managing to lift the siege of Tula on December 16th, and also encircled and destroyed Guderian's southern flank, and advanced to capture Kaluga on December the 28th. The very low temperatures paralyzed the Luftwaffe in late December, but the Soviet Air Force, operating from much better bases, managed to stay in the air and provide close support to the ground offensive. Hitler ordered an immediate air reinforcement for the Moscow front, hoping to still save the situation. 102 Junkers, 52 transport planes were used in a frantic effort to bring urgent supplies to the front line, miraculously managing to avoid its total collapse. When the weather cleared, on January 4, 1942, the Messerschmitts took off and began to drive Soviet aircraft from the front line, making it harder for the enemy attack to continue. With his reserves at the limit, Zhukov ordered a halt to his offensive on January 7, although Stalin insisted on demanding its continuation. The Red Army was exhausted at that point, but it had driven the Germans out of the vicinity of Moscow, forcing them to retreat 100 to 250 kilometers away from the capital, thus removing the immediate danger of its capture. That had been a Herculean effort achieved at great cost, but it had proven to the Germans that there would be no quick or easy end to the war in the East. From that point on, the two powers would try to catch their breath, and the speed and intensity of that recovery would determine who would come out victorious. While the Soviet Union had moved its industrial base to the distant countryside and was seeing a growing stream of foreign supplies entering its borders, the Third Reich was now in a dangerous position, diametrically different from that of a year earlier. From being the absolute mistress of Europe at the beginning of 1941, Germany now had, in the British Empire, an emboldened enemy, a gigantic conflict with no clear resolution against the Soviet Union, and it was also at war with the United States. The largest military invasion in history had resulted in a painful stalemate, with millions of dead covering the front lines and a devastating genocide taking place in the rear areas, setting the standard for what the world would witness in the years to come. Operation Barbarossa opened the bloody road for the deadly race of destruction between the two forces of totalitarianism. Did you like our story? If you like the work of the War Room and want to support us, you can do so by sending us a Pix or by contributing on Apoyacy. because that way you join our very important person WhatsApp group and help decide the next topics with me. I'd like to thank everyone who's helping out, but especially these comrades here who are top-notch. For now, watch these videos I picked out for you, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss any notifications. When I post more videos, I'll be back. Thanks again for watching and take care. From the War Room.